I learned something important about betrayal the day my daughter graduated from college. Sometimes the person who tries to humiliate you in public forgets that you might already know the truth. The stadium in Austin was already half full when I arrived that morning. Rows of folding chairs stretching across the football field like a patchwork quilt of blue and white. The Texas sun was warm, but not unbearable, the kind of late spring morning people like to remember years later when they talk about big family milestones. Parents held cameras, grandparents waved small school flags, and students in navy gowns moved in clusters along the sidelines, laughing in the nervous, excited way young people do when they know their lives are about to change. My daughter Emily was somewhere among them. I checked my watch. 10 minutes before the ceremony. I had arrived early because that was the kind of mother I had always been. Prepared. Quietly proud. I smoothed the sleeve of my cream-colored jacket and looked toward the stage where the podium stood waiting. In my purse, resting beneath my wallet and a pair of reading glasses, was a large manila envelope. I had checked it 3 times that morning before leaving the house. The papers inside were perfectly flat. Signed. Dated. Ready. But no one looking at me then would have guessed that. To everyone else, I was just another mother sitting in the stands, waiting to watch her daughter receive a diploma. I remember thinking how beautiful the day looked. The banners hanging from the stadium lights moved gently in the breeze. The brass band began warming up near the bleachers. Somewhere behind me someone uncorked a bottle of sparkling cider. It should have been a perfect morning. I even allowed myself a small smile when I spotted Emily walking across the field with her classmates, her tassel swinging against her shoulder. For a moment, everything felt simple. Then Richard arrived. My husband of 38 years moved down the aisle beside the folding chairs with the confident stride he had always carried, tall, silver-haired, wearing the navy suit I had pressed the night before. From a distance, he looked like the same man I had built a life with. The same man who used to stand in the kitchen on Sunday mornings making pancakes while Emily danced around the table in her pajamas. But when he sat beside me, I noticed the small things most people would miss. He didn't look at me right away. His phone was in his hand, screen dark but still warm from use. His jaw was tight, the way it got when he believed he was about to deliver important news. I folded my hands in my lap and watched the stage. "She looks happy," I said quietly, nodding toward Emily across the field. Richard followed my gaze, then cleared his throat. "Yes," he said. His voice sounded distant, like someone speaking through a closed door. The ceremony began a few minutes later. The principal welcomed everyone. A choir sang the national anthem. Parents applauded at every pause. I clapped too, because that's what mothers do. But I also watched Richard from the corner of my eye. He kept checking the crowd behind us, scanning the rows of chairs as if he expected to see someone arrive. And then I saw her. A woman in a white summer dress, standing near the aisle about 30 feet away. She was younger than most of the parents there, probably in her early 30s. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she held her phone as if she were ready to record something important. When Richard noticed her, something in his posture changed. It was subtle, a small lift of his shoulders. The kind of silent signal people exchange when they believe no one else understands what it means. But I understood. I had understood for 3 months. The band finished playing, and the principal invited a few parents to come forward for brief remarks about supporting students through their education. Richard stood up before anyone else could volunteer. A few people clapped politely as he walked toward the stage. I could feel the energy shift around us. Parents leaned forward. Cameras lifted. Emily's head turned toward the podium, curious and slightly confused. Richard adjusted the microphone and looked across the stadium with the confident smile he had practiced for years at company meetings and neighborhood events. "Good morning," he began. His voice carried clearly through the speakers. "Today is a special day for our children." People nodded. Some clapped again. He paused, letting the moment settle. I knew that pause. It was the same pause he used whenever he believed the next sentence would make people remember him. But I'd like to say something personal as well. A few murmurs moved through the audience. Emily frowned slightly from her place in the rows of graduates. I reached into my purse and felt the edge of the envelope beneath my fingers. The paper was smooth. Cool. Exactly where I had left it. Richard took a breath and looked directly at me. For a second, the stadium seemed to disappear. Just him and me, 30 yards apart, connected by 38 years of history and one decision he believed would shock everyone watching. After many years of marriage, he said into the microphone, I've decided it's time for my wife and me to go our separate ways. A ripple spread through the crowd. People turned their heads. I heard someone gasp quietly behind me. Emily stood up halfway from her chair, confusion written across her face. Richard continued speaking, explaining things in that careful, rehearsed tone that tries to sound reasonable while delivering something cruel. But I wasn't really listening anymore, because in that moment, I was thinking about the envelope in my purse, the documents inside it, the signatures at the bottom of each page, the quiet preparation that had already turned his announcement into something else entirely. When Richard finally finished and stepped down from the stage, the applause was thin and uncertain. He walked back toward the stands with the same confident stride he had used earlier, unaware that the story he believed he had just begun was already over. I stood up slowly as he approached. Then I opened my purse, took out the envelope, and waited for him to reach me. Richard stopped 2 steps in front of me, still holding the confidence of a man who believed he had just controlled the narrative of an entire morning. Around us, the stadium buzzed with confused whispers. Parents leaned toward one another, trying to understand what they had just heard over the loudspeakers. Emily was still standing among the graduates across the field, her cap slightly tilted as she searched the crowd for my face. I looked at my husband calmly and held the envelope out toward him. For a moment, he did not take it. His eyes moved from the envelope to my face, as if he expected anger or tears or some kind of dramatic reaction that would make him feel justified. But I felt none of those things anymore. I had already lived through them months ago. Finally, he reached forward and took the envelope from my hand. What is this? He asked quietly. His voice carried a hint of irritation, the way it did when he believed I was interrupting something important. I did not raise my voice. I simply said, You should open it. He hesitated, glancing around at the people watching us. Then he slid his finger beneath the flap and pulled the papers out halfway. I saw the moment his expression changed. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around his eyes. He looked up at me again, confusion beginning to replace the confidence he had walked back with from the stage. What is this supposed to mean? He asked. I folded my hands in front of me and spoke softly, so only he could hear. It means you are 3 months late to this conversation. Behind him, the woman in the white dress had started walking slowly toward us from the aisle. She moved carefully, as if she did not want to attract too much attention, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Richard followed my gaze and noticed her approaching. For a brief second, something like panic flashed across his face, though he quickly tried to hide it. He slid the papers back into the envelope and lowered his voice. Margaret, this is not the time for games, he said. I almost smiled at that word. Games. If only he knew how many quiet evenings I had spent at the kitchen table, learning the rules of the one he had been playing. You are right, I replied. It is not the time for games. That is why everything inside that envelope has already been filed. He stared at me. I could see his mind racing now, trying to piece together something he clearly had not expected. Filed, he repeated. With my attorney, I said calmly. The sound of applause rose again across the stadium as another student received a diploma, but around us the small circle of tension seemed strangely quiet. The woman in the white dress had reached the end of our row now. She stopped a few feet away, pretending to check her phone while listening closely. I had seen that posture before. People often believe they look invisible when they are really just standing still. Richard glanced toward her again and then back at me. You are overreacting, he said under his breath. You heard what I said up there. I was trying to handle this respectfully. Respectfully. The word hung in the warm Texas air between us. I looked past him toward the field where Emily was hugging one of her classmates. For a moment, I allowed myself to focus on the reason we were all there. My daughter had worked for 4 years to reach this day. She had studied late into the night, balanced 2 part-time jobs, and somehow still found time to call me every Sunday evening just to ask how I was doing. She deserved a graduation ceremony that people would remember for the right reasons. That was why I had remained quiet when Richard walked to the stage. That was why I had waited until he finished speaking. And that was why the envelope had been prepared long before this morning began. Richard, I said gently, do you remember the night in February when you told me you had to travel to Dallas for a conference? His eyes narrowed slightly. What does that have to do with anything? He asked. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I watched the woman in the white dress shift her weight from one foot to the other. She was listening now, without pretending otherwise. Finally, I continued. You left the house at 6:30 that morning, I said. You took the blue suitcase from the hall closet. The one with the broken zipper. Richard looked startled. How would you remember something like that? He asked. I kept my voice steady. Because after you left, your tablet was still on the kitchen counter. The email application was open. He did not speak. His silence told me he understood exactly what I was referring to. I could still picture that moment clearly. The sunlight coming through the kitchen window. The quiet hum of the refrigerator. The single message on the screen that had changed the direction of the rest of my life. I had not screamed when I read it. I had not called anyone. I had simply sat down in my chair and read the message again slowly from the beginning. Looking forward to finally telling her after the graduation. The email had said, once the house is sold, we will not have to worry about the retirement accounts anymore. I looked back at Richard now as the noise of the ceremony continued around us. You see, I said quietly. That was the morning I stopped being surprised by anything you might say in public. I watched Richard carefully as the meaning of my words began to settle in his mind. For years I had known every small expression on his face, every quiet signal that revealed what he was thinking before he said a word. That was what happens when you build a life beside someone for nearly 4 decades. You learn the rhythm of their thoughts the same way you learn the sound of your own footsteps in your home at night. Right now his confidence was cracking. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a thin fracture spreading through the certainty he had walked onto that stage with only minutes earlier. You read my email? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded once. Yes, I said. I read the entire conversation. Behind him, the woman in the white dress had stopped pretending to look at her phone. Her attention was fixed entirely on us now. I could feel her eyes studying my face, trying to understand how much I truly knew. The stadium announcer called another graduate's name, and a wave of applause rolled through the stands, but the sound seemed far away. Richard leaned closer to me, lowering his voice even more. Margaret, that message did not mean what you think it meant. I let the silence sit between us for a moment. It was a silence I had grown comfortable with during the last 3 months. When you discover something that changes your entire understanding of your life, the first reaction is usually noise. Questions, arguments, accusations. But after that comes a different kind of quiet. A quiet where you begin to see things clearly for the first time. The message said you planned to tell me after the graduation, I said calmly. And that once the house was sold, you and Vanessa would not need to worry about retirement accounts anymore. I watched the woman's face when I spoke her name. That was the first moment she realized she was not invisible to me. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, and she took a small step forward as if she wanted to say something. Richard noticed it too. He turned, halfway toward her, and then back toward me again, trapped between 2 conversations he clearly wished were not happening at the same time. You are taking this out of context, he insisted. You always jump to conclusions. The strange thing about that accusation was that it would have been true once. There was a time when I trusted Richard enough to doubt my own instincts. If something felt wrong, I would tell myself I was imagining it. If he came home late, I believed his explanations without question. But that morning in February had changed something inside me. I still remember sitting at the kitchen table with his tablet in my hands. The sunlight had moved slowly across the floor while I read every message in that thread. There were dozens of them. Some were short and practical, discussing dates and travel plans. Others were longer, written late at night, when people tend to speak more honestly than they intend to. They talked about the house we had built together 22 years earlier. They talked about my retirement savings as if it were a resource they could simply rearrange once I was out of the way. But the sentence that stayed with me the most was simple. She will never see it coming. I remember reading that line 3 times. Not because it was confusing, because it was so clear. The woman in the white dress finally stepped closer. Richard, she said quietly, her voice careful and controlled. Maybe this conversation should happen somewhere else. I turned toward her for the first time since she had approached. Up close, she looked younger than I had first thought, perhaps 32 or 33. Her makeup was subtle, the kind meant to look effortless, and her expression carried the polite confidence of someone who believed she understood the situation. You must be Vanessa, I said gently. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. Yes, she said, and I think this is a misunderstanding. I almost admired the simplicity of that sentence. People often reach for that word when the truth begins to surface. Misunderstanding. As if clarity itself were the problem. Richard shifted uncomfortably beside us. Margaret, we can discuss this later, he said. Today is Emily's day. Let us not make a scene. I looked past them again toward the field where the graduates were lining up to move toward the stage. Emily was laughing with another student, completely unaware that the quiet structure of her parents' marriage had already collapsed hours earlier. You are right about one thing, I said softly. Today is Emily's day. Then I looked back at Richard and the envelope still in his hand. That is why I waited until now to say anything. He frowned slightly. Waited for what? He asked. I nodded toward the papers inside the envelope. For you to finish your announcement, I said. Because you wanted everyone here to hear your decision. Richard stared at me, confusion slowly turning into something heavier. What are you talking about? He asked. I felt the breeze move gently through the stadium and watched the tassels on the graduates' caps sway in the sunlight. For the first time that morning, I allowed myself a small, calm breath. I am talking about the other documents in that envelope, I said quietly. The ones your attorney has not seen yet. Richard looked down at the envelope again as if it had suddenly become heavier in his hands. For the first time since he stepped onto the stage, the certainty in his posture had begun to disappear. Vanessa was standing beside him now, close enough that the three of us formed a quiet triangle in the middle of the crowded row of seats. Around us, the graduation ceremony continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Another name was called over the loudspeaker. Applause rose and faded again. A child somewhere behind us laughed loudly before being hushed by a parent. The ordinary rhythm of the morning continued, but within that small circle, everything had shifted. Richard pulled the papers halfway out of the envelope again, scanning the first page quickly. His eyes moved faster this time, searching for something he clearly had not expected to find. These are divorce documents, he said quietly. I nodded once. Yes, I replied. They are. He looked up at me sharply. But I did not file anything, he said. Of course you did not, I answered calmly. I did. Vanessa's expression tightened slightly as she listened. She folded her arms loosely across her waist, the confident posture she had worn earlier now replaced by something more cautious. Richard flipped to the second page, reading more slowly now. His lips moved faintly as his eyes traveled across the lines. Margaret, this is ridiculous, he said after a moment. You cannot just file for divorce without even discussing it with me. I felt a quiet calm settle in my chest as I watched him. 3 months earlier, I might have felt anger hearing those words. Now they sounded almost distant, like something spoken in a room down the hall. I could have discussed it with you, I said gently. But the email suggested you already had your own plan. Vanessa shifted again, her voice entering the conversation carefully. Richard told me the two of you had been unhappy for years, she said. He said the separation was something you both understood was coming. I turned toward her and studied her face for a moment. There was something almost sincere in her expression, as if she truly believed the version of events she had been given. That realization did not make me angry. If anything, it made the entire situation feel strangely predictable. Did he also tell you about the retirement accounts? I asked softly. Her brows knit together slightly. What do you mean? She asked. Richard spoke quickly before I could answer. Margaret, this is not the place to talk about finances, he said. We can settle everything privately with our attorneys. I noticed the way he emphasized that last word, as if reminding me that he believed the legal process would protect him. I looked down briefly at the envelope still in his hands. That is exactly what I did, I said. 3 months ago. Richard frowned. What are you talking about? He asked. I tilted my head slightly toward the papers. You have not reached the third document yet, I said calmly. He hesitated before turning another page. This time his reaction was immediate. His shoulders stiffened and his eyes widened just enough for me to recognize the moment he understood what he was looking at. Vanessa leaned closer, trying to see the page as well. What is it? She asked. Richard did not answer right away. He stared at the document for several seconds before lifting his head slowly. You froze the accounts, he said, disbelief creeping into his voice. I folded my hands together again. Yes, I replied. 2 months ago. Vanessa blinked. What accounts? She asked quietly. I looked directly at her. The joint retirement accounts that Richard mentioned in his email, I said. The ones he planned to move after selling the house. The color drained slightly from Richard's face. You had no right to do that without telling me, he said. His voice was still low, but the calm control he had shown earlier was beginning to slip. I met his gaze without raising my own voice. Actually, I had every right, I said. My name is on those accounts too. Behind us, another round of applause filled the stadium as Emily's row began moving toward the stage. I watched her walk slowly with the other graduates, her gown catching the sunlight as she climbed the short set of steps near the podium. For a moment, the entire world seemed to narrow to that single image. My daughter reaching the end of something she had worked hard to achieve. I wanted that moment to remain untouched by the quiet conflict unfolding in the seats behind her. Richard followed my gaze and saw Emily walking across the stage. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if the reality of the day had finally begun to reach him. Margaret, he said quietly, this does not have to become a war. I considered that word carefully. War. It sounded dramatic and loud and destructive. But the truth was far simpler than that. I had not been fighting him at all. I had simply been preparing. It is not a war, I said softly. It is paperwork. Vanessa looked between the two of us, her earlier confidence fading with each new sentence she heard. Richard, she said cautiously, maybe we should read everything in that envelope before making assumptions. I almost smiled again. That was the most practical suggestion anyone had made all morning. Richard glanced down at the documents once more, flipping through the remaining pages slowly now, as if each sheet might reveal something even more unexpected than the last. I watched his face carefully, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, just with the quiet awareness of someone who had already reached the end of a long road. When he finally looked back up at me, the expression in his eyes was no longer confident. It was uncertain, and uncertainty, I had learned, often arrives when someone realizes the story they plan to control has already been written by someone else. Richard kept turning the pages slowly, as if the documents might change if he waited long enough. The confident man who had walked onto the stage earlier that morning was fading with every line he read. Vanessa leaned closer again, trying to understand what was happening, but Richard shifted the envelope slightly away from her view. The movement was small, but I noticed it. People often reveal their priorities in moments like that. A few minutes earlier, he had been comfortable making announcements in front of hundreds of people. Now he suddenly wanted privacy. The stadium announcer called another graduate's name, and the crowd erupted into applause again. I looked toward the stage just in time to see Emily shaking hands with the dean. Her smile was wide and genuine, the kind of smile that comes from years of effort finally paying off. For a moment, I let that image settle in my mind. I had promised myself that no matter what happened between Richard and me, Emily's achievement would remain the most important part of this day. Richard cleared his throat quietly beside me. Margaret, he said, his voice lower than before, you went through my accounts. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I watched Emily walk down the steps from the stage holding her diploma. She looked toward the stands again, searching for us in the crowd. I raised my hand slightly, so she could see me, and she waved back quickly before returning to her seat. Only then did I look back at Richard. No, I said calmly. I went through our accounts. He frowned, as if the distinction bothered him. You hired an attorney without telling me, he continued. You froze assets. You filed documents with the court. That is not something a person does quietly. I folded my hands in my lap again. Actually, it is, I replied. If you plan carefully. Vanessa let out a small breath beside him. The sound was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. Richard told me you were unaware of everything, she said. He said the announcement today would give you time to adjust. I looked at her gently. That must have sounded very considerate, I said. Her eyes dropped briefly toward the envelope again. He did not mention anything about legal filings, she added quietly. Richard shifted uncomfortably. This is getting blown out of proportion, he said. Margaret always had a dramatic side. I studied him for a moment. It was interesting how quickly people reach for familiar explanations when their plans collapse. Dramatic, emotional, unstable. Words that make a situation sound unreasonable even when the facts are simple. I spoke slowly so that every word felt calm and clear. Richard, I said, 3 months ago I read an email where you explained how you planned to sell our house after Emily graduated. In the same message you wrote, that once the money was moved, we would not have to worry about the retirement accounts anymore. Those were your exact words. Vanessa's head turned sharply toward him. You said the accounts were separate, she said. Richard hesitated. That brief silence answered the question better than any explanation could have. I watched Vanessa process the information quietly. It was not anger that appeared on her face first. It was confusion, the kind that comes when someone realizes a story they believed might not have been complete. Richard rubbed the bridge of his nose as if trying to think quickly. "This is not the place to go over financial details," he said again. "We can resolve everything with the attorneys." I nodded slightly. "Yes," I said. "That is exactly what will happen." The wind shifted lightly across the stadium and the banners along the railings fluttered in the warm air. Families were beginning to gather near the edge of the field now, preparing to meet the graduates once the ceremony ended. Laughter drifted up from the lower rows where students were taking photos together. The entire environment felt strangely normal compared to the quiet conversation unfolding between the three of us. Richard looked down at the envelope again and slowly removed the final document. His eyes scanned the page quickly before stopping at the bottom. I recognized the moment he reached the signature line. "You already signed everything," he said quietly. I nodded once. 2 weeks ago. He looked up at me. "You never said a word," he added. There was something almost amazed in his voice now, as if silence itself had become unexpected. I thought back to the weeks after I discovered the emails. The evenings when Richard came home talking about business trips and meetings while I listened carefully to every detail. The mornings when he drank coffee at the kitchen counter while I checked the calendar for my next appointment with the attorney. Preparation does not always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it looks exactly like patience. There was nothing to say, I told him calmly. Vanessa spoke again, her voice quieter now. "What happens next?" she asked. Richard did not answer her. He was still staring at the papers as if trying to reverse something that had already moved too far forward. I reached toward the envelope and gently tapped the corner with my finger. "Next," I said softly, "you finish reading what is inside." Richard stood very still after I said those words. For a moment, the noise of the graduation ceremony filled the space between us again, as if the world had politely stepped forward to cover the silence. Students were lining up near the edge of the field, and parents had begun moving toward the railing with cameras raised. The smell of warm grass and sunscreen drifted through the air. It was the kind of ordinary scene people remember years later with fondness. Yet in the small circle around our seats, everything felt suspended. Richard looked down at the last page again. His fingers tightened slightly on the paper, as if he needed something solid to hold on to while his thoughts rearranged themselves. Vanessa leaned closer once more, her curiosity no longer hidden. "Richard," she said quietly, "what does it say?" He did not answer her immediately. Instead, he read the page from the top again, slower this time. I could almost see the moment each line reached him. His shoulders dropped slightly as he reached the middle of the page, and when his eyes moved toward the bottom, his expression hardened with something that looked less like anger and more like disbelief. "You reported the transfer attempts," he said finally. I nodded. "Yes," I said calmly. Vanessa blinked. "Transfer attempts?" she repeated. Richard let out a slow breath through his nose, still staring at the document. "The bank flagged the requests," he said quietly. "She must have contacted them first." I kept my voice steady. "I contacted them the same week I read your email," I said. Vanessa looked back and forth between us, trying to follow the conversation. "What transfer?" she asked again. Richard hesitated. That hesitation seemed to stretch longer than any speech he had given earlier that morning. Finally, he spoke without looking at her. "The retirement accounts," he said. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. "I thought you said those funds were separate," she said. Richard did not respond. The absence of an answer was louder than anything he could have said. I watched Vanessa absorb the information slowly. A few minutes earlier, she had stood beside him with quiet confidence, believing she understood the situation. Now she seemed uncertain where she belonged in the conversation. The stadium announcer began congratulating the graduating class again, his voice echoing through the speakers while students cheered across the field. I looked toward Emily and saw her laughing with 2 friends as they took photos with their diplomas. Her happiness felt bright and uncomplicated in a way that made the rest of the morning feel strangely distant. Richard finally folded the documents together again and slid them back into the envelope. "Margaret," he said carefully, "you could have spoken to me before doing all of this." I met his eyes calmly. "I did speak to you," I replied. "You just did not know it at the time." He frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" I thought about the evenings when he sat across from me at the dinner table, describing future plans with casual certainty. The trips he mentioned, the house improvements he said we should postpone, the way he avoided any discussion about long-term finances whenever I asked questions. Those conversations had told me everything I needed to know. It means I listened, I said quietly. Vanessa shifted her weight again, her earlier composure gone now. Richard, she said softly, did you know about this? He shook his head slowly. No, he admitted. I did not. I watched the two of them stand side by side for a moment. Something about their posture had changed. Earlier, they had seemed united by a shared expectation. Now that expectation had disappeared, leaving them unsure where to stand. Richard finally turned back toward me. Freezing the accounts will complicate everything, he said. The attorneys will have to review the entire situation. I nodded once. They already have, I replied. That answer seemed to land heavily between us. Richard stared at me again, studying my face as if searching for the person he believed he had known for 38 years. Perhaps he expected to see anger there, or bitterness. But the truth was simpler. The anger had passed weeks ago. What remained was clarity. You planned this, he said quietly. I considered. The word for a moment before answering. I prepared, I said. Behind us a group of parents began clapping again as the final graduates were announced. The ceremony was nearly finished now. People were standing, gathering their belongings, preparing to move toward the field. The energy in the stadium had shifted from formal celebration to excited reunion. Richard glanced toward the stage where Emily was beginning to walk with the rest of her class toward the exit gate. She does not know any of this, he said. No, I replied. She does not. Vanessa spoke again, more cautiously now. Does she eventually find out? She asked. I looked toward Emily as she moved through the crowd of graduates. Her cap tilted slightly as she laughed with a friend beside her. For a moment, I felt a quiet sense of pride that had nothing to do with the envelope or the conversation around me. Only if it becomes necessary, I said softly. Richard looked down at the envelope in his hands one last time. The man who had stood at the microphone earlier that morning announcing the end of our marriage now seemed unsure what to say next. I watched him carefully, noticing how different he appeared without the certainty he had carried onto the stage. And in that moment I realized something simple. The most surprising part of the entire morning was not that he had chosen to leave. It was that he had believed he was the one making the decision. I watched Emily step through the exit gate with the rest of the graduating class, the sunlight catching the blue ribbon around her diploma as she walked across the field toward the crowd of waiting families. And for the first time that morning my attention left Richard completely, because that moment belonged to her, not to the quiet unraveling happening beside me in the stadium seats. Parents were already moving down the steps, calling their children's names and holding out phones for photographs, and I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my light gray jacket as I kept my eyes on Emily so she could find me in the crowd. Richard remained seated for a moment longer, the envelope still in his hand as if it had become heavier than he expected. Vanessa stood beside him, looking uncertain whether to follow him or to step away entirely, and the confidence she carried earlier had faded into something quieter and more cautious. Richard finally rose and looked at me again, his expression tight with the realization that the simple story he planned for today had become something much more complicated. Margaret, he said quietly, we need to talk about this somewhere private. His voice had lost the public confidence it carried when he stood at the microphone earlier, and now it sounded more like a request than a declaration. I met his eyes calmly. We will talk, I said, but not today. He blinked once as if the answer surprised him. This affects both of us, he replied. I nodded slightly. It has affected both of us for months, I said. Vanessa glanced toward the field again, where Emily was now walking toward the stands with her friends, laughing as they compared their diplomas and pointed toward their families in the crowd. The celebration around us had grown louder as more parents rushed forward with flowers and balloons, and the bright atmosphere made the tension in our small circle feel strangely out of place. Richard looked down at the envelope again. You said the attorneys already reviewed everything, he said slowly. Yes, I replied. Several times. He inhaled deeply as if preparing to say something more forceful, but the words did not come immediately. Instead he glanced toward Emily, and then back at me. She is going to ask questions, he said. I followed his gaze across the field where Emily had finally spotted us, and was waving excitedly, raising her diploma high in the air as if she could not wait to show it to us up close. I raised my hand and waved back with a smile. "She will ask about her graduation day," I said gently. "And that is exactly what we will talk about." Vanessa shifted slightly beside him. "Do you really plan to keep everything from her?" she asked quietly. I turned my head toward her for the first time in several minutes. There was something almost apologetic in her expression now, as if she had stepped into a story without realizing how many chapters had already been written before she arrived. "Emily deserves to celebrate today," I said. "The rest can wait." Richard looked frustrated, but he did not argue with that point. Even he understood that interrupting Emily's moment would only draw more attention than he wanted. The three of us began walking down the stadium steps with the rest of the crowd, moving slowly between families carrying flowers and congratulatory signs. The afternoon sun felt warm against my shoulders as we reached the lower walkway near the field entrance. Emily spotted us again and started jogging toward the railing, her graduation cap slightly crooked from the movement. When she reached us, she laughed breathlessly and held the diploma toward me first. "Mom, look," she said, her voice full of excitement. I actually did it. I wrapped my arms around her in a long hug, feeling the smooth paper of the diploma press lightly between us. "Of course you did," I said softly. "You worked for it every single day." She stepped back with a bright smile and turned toward Richard next. "Did you hear the speech the dean gave about the future?" she asked eagerly. "It was actually good." Richard forced a small smile and nodded. "I heard it," he said. "You should be proud of yourself." Emily noticed the envelope in his hand and tilted her head curiously. "What is that?" she asked. Richard hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "Just paperwork," he said. I watched him carefully as he spoke, noticing how quickly he chose the simplest explanation available. Emily accepted the answer without suspicion because her mind was filled with other things. "Come on," she said excitedly, grabbing my arm. "They are letting families onto the field for photos." She pulled me gently toward the gate, while still talking about her professors and her plans for the evening celebration with friends. I glanced back once and saw Richard and Vanessa following a few steps behind us, walking more slowly now as the reality of the day settled around them. The field stretched out bright and green under the afternoon sun as we stepped through the gate together, surrounded by hundreds of families celebrating the same milestone. Emily moved ahead to join her friends for a quick photograph, and I stood quietly near the sideline, watching her laugh with the easy confidence of someone standing at the beginning of her life rather than the middle of a complicated story. Richard stopped beside me after a moment, the envelope still tucked under his arm. "This is not finished," he said quietly. I looked out across the field where Emily was posing with her friends and lifting her diploma again while cameras flashed. "No," I agreed calmly. "It is only beginning." Emily stood with her friends near the center of the field, holding her diploma carefully while several parents circled around them with cameras and phones, and the air was filled with the kind of laughter that belongs to milestones people wait years to reach. I watched her from a few steps away, letting the moment settle in quietly, because despite everything that had happened earlier that morning, this day still belonged to her. Richard stood beside me with the envelope tucked under his arm, though he no longer looked at it as often as he had in the stands. Instead, his eyes followed Emily across the field, and for a moment his expression softened with the kind of pride that had once defined our family gatherings for many years. Vanessa lingered slightly behind us, standing near the sideline as if she was not quite certain where she should position herself in a celebration that had begun long before she arrived. Emily waved us closer. "Mom, Dad, come here," she called excitedly. "They are taking a group photo." Richard and I stepped forward together, moving through clusters of graduates who were hugging their parents and laughing with friends. The photographer counted down while the students lifted their diplomas and caps into the air. Emily slipped her arm through mine as the camera flashed and leaned her head briefly against my shoulder. "I still cannot believe it is over," she said with a breathless laugh. "For years just disappeared." I smiled gently. "They did not disappear," I told her. "They built something." She nodded as if she liked that answer, and then turned toward Richard. "We are meeting everyone at the restaurant tonight," she said. "You are both still coming, right?" Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Of course," he said. I noticed how quickly he chose certainty, even though the morning had already complicated every plan he might have imagined. Emily looked relieved. Good, she said. Because Professor Hayes is bringing his wife and half the class is going to be there. It will be like one big reunion already. She laughed again and moved a few steps away to take another photograph with two friends who had just arrived with flowers. I remained standing where I was, watching the field fill with small circles of families celebrating together. Richard shifted beside me and spoke quietly so Emily could not hear. Dinner might not be the best idea, he said. I glanced toward him calmly. It is Emily's idea, I replied. She planned it weeks ago. He exhaled slowly, as if weighing his options. Margaret, we cannot pretend everything is normal. I looked across the field again where Emily was adjusting her cap, while her friends teased her about how crooked it had become. The afternoon sun reflected off the metal bleachers, and the stadium speakers were now playing light music as the ceremony officially concluded. For a few hours, I said quietly, we can. Vanessa stepped closer at that moment, her voice careful when she spoke. Emily seems very happy, she said softly. I turned toward her. She worked very hard for this day, I replied. Vanessa nodded, watching Emily with a thoughtful expression. I did not realize how important this ceremony would be for her, she admitted. Richard said nothing, but I noticed his jaw tighten slightly as he listened. The three of us stood there for another minute before Emily returned, holding a small bouquet someone had given her. Mom, they are letting us walk around the field before everyone leaves, she said. You should see the view from the center. It is amazing. She reached for my hand and pulled me gently forward before I could answer. Richard followed beside us, and Vanessa trailed a few steps behind as we crossed the grass toward the middle of the stadium. From that vantage point the stands looked enormous, rows of blue seats rising high under the bright afternoon sky. Emily spun slowly in a small circle, laughing as the wind tugged at her graduation gown. I have been looking up at those seats for 4 years during games, she said. Standing down here feels completely different. I watched her face as she spoke, noticing how hopeful she looked when she talked about the future. In that moment, the envelope, the documents, and the complicated conversations waiting after today all seemed temporarily distant. Richard stood quietly beside us, his attention fixed on Emily now rather than the legal reality he had just discovered. You did well, he said to her after a moment. Emily smiled warmly at him. Thanks, Dad. The simplicity of that exchange hung in the air for a moment longer than usual. Then Emily clapped her hands together suddenly. Okay, one more picture, she said. This time with both of you. She positioned us carefully, placing me on one side and Richard on the other while a friend raised a phone to take the photograph. As the camera counted down, I noticed Richard glance briefly toward the envelope still tucked beneath his arm. The same envelope that had quietly shifted the balance of the morning. The photo was taken in a single flash of light. Emily laughed when she saw it on the screen and declared it perfect. She hugged us both quickly before running off again to join another group of friends near the far sideline. I remained standing there for a moment, feeling the soft grass beneath my shoes and listening to the distant cheers still echoing through the stadium. Richard looked down at the envelope once more before speaking quietly beside me. You knew this would change everything, he said. I watched Emily across the field, surrounded by laughter and celebration. No, I said calmly. I knew everything had already changed. I stood quietly near the center of the field while Emily disappeared into another circle of friends laughing over photographs and plans for the evening. And for the first time since the ceremony began, the noise around us started to fade into a steady background rhythm rather than something that demanded my attention. Families were slowly drifting toward the stadium exits now, some carrying bouquets and balloons, others simply walking arm in arm with their graduates as if they were reluctant to let the moment end. Richard remained beside me with the envelope still tucked under his arm, although the grip he held on it earlier had loosened slightly, as though the realization inside those pages had finally settled into something permanent. Vanessa stood a few feet away looking across the field toward Emily and her friends, and there was a thoughtful quietness about her now that had not been there when she first appeared in the stands earlier that morning. Richard cleared his throat after a moment. Margaret, he said quietly, we cannot avoid the conversation forever. I turned toward him calmly. We are not avoiding it, I replied. We are postponing it until the right time. He studied my face as if searching for a reaction he had expected to see hours ago. You seem very calm about everything, he said. I gave a small nod. Calm is what preparation looks like, I answered. Vanessa glanced between us before speaking carefully. Richard told me you had no idea about his plans, she said. He said the announcement today would be difficult but necessary. I met her eyes gently. Sometimes people confuse silence with ignorance, I said. Richard shifted uncomfortably and looked toward Emily again. She was now standing with two classmates near the 50-yard line while a professor posed with them for a photograph. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the field, and the air had cooled slightly compared to the warmth earlier in the day. What happens now? Richard asked. I could hear the uncertainty in his voice even though he tried to keep it steady. The attorneys review the documents, I said. They continue the process that has already begun. He frowned slightly. You mean the divorce filing? He said quietly. I nodded once. Vanessa looked surprised. You already filed? She asked. Richard glanced toward her quickly as if he had hoped that detail would remain private. I kept my tone calm. 2 weeks ago, I said. The information seemed to settle between them like a stone dropped into still water. Vanessa looked back at Richard, her eyebrows lifting slightly. You told me you were handling that after today, she said. Richard did not answer immediately. His silence stretched just long enough for the truth to become clear without explanation. I watched Vanessa process that realization with a slow exhale. The confidence she had carried earlier in the stands had completely disappeared now, replaced by something more cautious and uncertain. I think I misunderstood the situation, she said quietly. Richard rubbed his forehead, as if the afternoon sun had suddenly become too bright. Everyone is misunderstanding the situation, he replied. I considered that statement for a moment before answering. No, I said softly. Everyone is finally understanding it. Emily waved again from across the field and began jogging back toward us, her gown fluttering slightly as she moved through clusters of families gathering near the exit gates. When she reached us, she was still smiling, though she looked a little breathless from the running. They are closing the field in about 10 minutes, she said. Everyone is heading toward the parking lot. She looked from me to Richard with bright anticipation. Are we still going to dinner? She asked. Richard opened his mouth as if he might hesitate again, but this time I answered first. Yes, I said. Emily clapped her hands together happily. Perfect, she said. The reservation is at 6 o'clock. It is only about 15 minutes from here. She glanced at Vanessa curiously for the first time since the ceremony ended. Are you joining us too? She asked politely. Vanessa looked startled by the invitation and glanced quickly at Richard before responding. I do not think that would be appropriate, she said gently. Emily nodded with simple understanding, clearly not reading any deeper meaning into the exchange. Maybe another time, she said with a friendly smile before turning back toward me. Mom, we should head to the car before the traffic gets crazy. I agreed and began walking with her toward the stadium exit, leaving Richard and Vanessa a few steps behind us again. As we moved through the crowd, Emily slipped her arm through mine the same way she had earlier during the photographs. Today was amazing, she said quietly. I am really glad both of you were here. I felt a small warmth in my chest hearing those words. We would not have missed it, I said. Behind us I could hear Richard's footsteps catching up as we reached the wide concrete walkway outside the stadium gates. Cars filled the parking lots in long rows and families were loading bouquets and graduation caps into trunks while continuing their celebrations in the golden light of the afternoon. Emily walked ahead toward our car, still talking about her friends and the plans for the evening. Richard slowed beside me for a moment before we reached the vehicle. You changed the story, he said quietly. I looked straight ahead at Emily unlocking the car with her keys. No, I replied calmly. I only finished the chapter you started. Emily unlocked the car and tossed her graduation cap gently onto the back seat before turning toward us again with the same bright energy she had carried all afternoon. The parking lot was crowded with families loading gifts and flowers into their vehicles, while the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement. I could hear laughter drifting from every direction as graduates posed for one last photograph beside decorated cars and congratulatory signs. Emily leaned against the driver's door and looked at both of us with an expression that mixed excitement with exhaustion. I cannot believe how tired I suddenly feel, she said with a small laugh. 4 years of classes and somehow graduation day is the thing that drains all the energy. I smiled at her, and reached forward to adjust the crooked tassel still hanging from her cap before she noticed it. That happens when a person carries an entire chapter of life on their shoulders, I said softly. Once it ends, the weight finally comes down. She nodded as if that explanation made perfect sense, and then opened the car door. The restaurant is only 15 minutes away, she said. We should leave before the traffic builds. Richard stepped forward beside the car and placed the envelope carefully on the passenger seat, as if he had finally decided that carrying it openly no longer made sense. His movements were slower now than they had been earlier in the stadium, and I could see the quiet tension in the way he held his shoulders. Emily noticed his expression and tilted her head slightly. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked. Richard forced a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Just a long day," he said. Emily seemed satisfied with that answer and climbed into the driver's seat while I settled into the back seat behind her. Richard took the passenger seat where the envelope rested beside him, and for a moment he simply stared at it before pulling the door closed. The car filled with a brief silence as Emily started the engine and adjusted the rearview mirror. "Everyone is meeting us there," she said cheerfully as she backed out of the parking space. "Professor Hayes already texted me and said half the class arrived early." The car moved slowly through the crowded lot, weaving between rows of vehicles filled with families celebrating their graduates. Emily continued talking about her friends and the plans they were making for the summer while the radio played softly in the background. I watched the stadium fade in the rear window as we turned onto the main road leading away from campus. For the first time all day, the environment felt calm and enclosed, removed from the noise of the ceremony and the crowd. Richard shifted slightly in his seat and glanced back toward me. "Margaret," he said quietly, "we should schedule a time to discuss everything with the attorneys." Emily looked briefly at him in the mirror, but kept her attention on the road. "Discuss what?" she asked casually. Richard hesitated, clearly aware that any explanation now would break the careful balance we had maintained all afternoon. I spoke gently before he answered. "Your father is talking about some paperwork we have been sorting through," I said. Emily nodded without suspicion. "Adult paperwork," she said with a small grin. "The most boring category of conversation." Richard did not smile at the joke, but he accepted the simple explanation with a quiet breath. The car continued down the road lined with tall oak trees that shaded the campus entrance. Emily tapped the steering wheel lightly to the rhythm of the music while the sunlight filtered through the leaves above us. "I was thinking about something earlier," she said suddenly. "When I walked across the stage, I kept remembering the first day you dropped me off here. Mom, you cried in the parking lot." I laughed softly at the memory. "I cried because you were starting something important," I said. "Not because you were leaving." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "It feels strange to realize that I am already at the other end of it," she said. Richard turned his head slightly toward the window, watching the campus buildings slide past as we drove away. "Life moves faster than people expect," he said quietly. Emily glanced at him in the mirror again. "That sounds serious," she said. "Graduation is supposed to be the happy kind of serious." Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the envelope resting beside him and then closed his eyes briefly as if considering something carefully. After a moment he spoke again, his voice calmer than before. "It is a proud day," he said. Emily smiled at the answer and turned the car toward the main street where restaurants and small shops lined the sidewalks near campus. Groups of graduates in caps and gowns were already walking between cafes and bakeries celebrating with their families. The golden light of early evening had begun to settle across the town, giving everything a warm glow that made the entire day feel almost cinematic. Emily slowed the car near a traffic light and looked back at me. "Again, Mom, thank you for always showing up," she said suddenly. "Every school play, every exam week, every terrible dorm dinner when you came to visit. I know it sounds silly, but it mattered." I felt a quiet warmth spread through my chest hearing those words. "Showing up is never silly," I told her gently. The traffic light turned green, and the car rolled forward again toward the restaurant where her friends were waiting. Richard adjusted the envelope slightly on his lap, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The conversation he expected to control earlier that morning had taken a very different path, and now the future waited somewhere beyond this evening's celebration. I leaned back against the seat and watched the town pass outside the window, knowing that the story Richard believed he had written was no longer the only version that existed. Emily turned into the small parking lot beside the restaurant just as the sky began shifting toward the soft gold of early evening, and the place was already alive with the sound of celebration because several groups of graduates had clearly chosen the same idea for dinner. Cars filled most of the spaces and colorful balloons were tied to a few side mirrors, gently moving in the breeze. Emily parked near the edge of the lot and turned off the engine, letting out a long breath before she looked back at us again with the same bright excitement that had carried her through the entire day. "Okay," she said with a smile. "This is officially the celebration part." I stepped out of the car and smoothed the sleeves of my jacket while the warm evening air settled around us. Through the restaurant windows, I could already see several students gathered at a long table near the back, laughing and waving when they noticed Emily approaching. Richard stepped out of the passenger side more slowly, holding the envelope loosely now rather than guarding it the way he had earlier in the day. For a brief moment, he simply stood beside the car and looked toward the restaurant entrance, as if measuring the distance between the quiet conversation that still waited and the celebration Emily deserved. Emily slipped her graduation cap back onto her head with a playful grin before walking ahead toward the door. "Come on," she said over her shoulder. "Everyone is already inside." We followed her through the entrance where the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the room. The restaurant had a warm atmosphere with wooden tables and soft yellow lights hanging from the ceiling, and nearly every table seemed to hold a group celebrating the same milestone. Emily's friends greeted her immediately with cheers when she reached their table, and someone lifted a phone to capture another photograph while the group crowded together. I stood a few steps back for a moment watching her laugh with the easy joy of someone whose future was just beginning to unfold. Richard took the seat beside her while I sat across from them, and the envelope disappeared quietly into the inside pocket of his jacket, as if he finally understood that it did not belong on the table tonight. Emily's friend Daniel raised a glass of sparkling cider and smiled at her. "To the smartest person in our statistics class," he announced. The group laughed and lifted their glasses together while Emily covered her face in mock embarrassment. "Do not remind me about statistics," she said with a groan that made everyone laugh again. The conversation quickly shifted into stories about late nights studying and professors who assigned impossible reading lists, and for a while the tension from earlier in the day seemed to dissolve into the comfortable rhythm of celebration. I noticed Richard watching Emily closely while she spoke with her friends, his expression thoughtful in a way that had not been there earlier. At one point, Emily leaned toward him and asked something about a summer internship she had been offered in another city. Richard listened carefully and nodded while she explained the details, and I could see the familiar pride returning to his voice when he responded. "That sounds like a good opportunity," he told her. Emily beamed at the encouragement. "I thought you would say that," she replied. The waiter arrived with menus and congratulated the graduates before taking drink orders from the table. Outside the windows, the evening had grown darker, and the lights along the street cast a soft glow across the sidewalks where more graduates were walking between restaurants and cafes. The energy of the town felt hopeful and alive, the way it always does when hundreds of young people step into the next stage of their lives at the same moment. During a pause in the conversation, Emily turned toward me with a thoughtful expression. "Mom," she said quietly, "earlier today when I walked across the stage, I looked up into the stands and saw both of you there. That was the only thing I was hoping for." Her voice carried a simple sincerity that made the entire table fall silent for a second. I reached across and gently squeezed her hand. "We would always be there for that moment," I told her. She smiled softly before the conversation resumed around us, but I noticed Richard glance briefly toward the inside pocket of his jacket where the envelope rested. For a moment his eyes lingered there before he looked back at Emily again. Later, while the others were distracted discussing their travel plans for the summer, Richard leaned slightly toward me and spoke quietly, so only I could hear. "You handled today better than I expected," he said. I considered that statement for a moment before answering. "Today was never about handling you," I replied calmly. "It was about protecting her day." He nodded slowly, as if the distinction finally made sense. Across the table, Emily laughed at something her friend had said and lifted her glass again for another toast. I watched her smile in the warm glow of the restaurant lights and realized that despite everything that had changed between Richard and me, one thing had remained exactly the same. We had both shown up for the moment that mattered most to her, even if the future waiting beyond tonight would look very different from the life we once imagined. The dinner continued with the comfortable rhythm of laughter and conversation that fills a room when people know they are celebrating the beginning of something new. Plates arrived, glasses were lifted in small toasts, and Emily's friends filled the table with stories about the past 4 years as if they were trying to capture every memory before life carried them in different directions. I sat quietly for a while simply listening, watching Emily speak with the kind of confidence that comes from someone who has finally stepped into her own future. Richard remained beside her, nodding occasionally and answering questions when the conversation turned toward family stories or childhood memories. For most of the evening, the envelope stayed hidden in the inside pocket of his jacket, untouched and unmentioned, like a quiet reminder that the chapter closing between us would wait until another day. At one point, Emily leaned back in her chair and looked around the table with a thoughtful smile. "You know something strange," she said. "All afternoon people kept asking what I plan to do next, but I keep thinking about how many people helped me reach today." Her eyes moved toward me first, and then toward Richard. It never felt like I was doing it alone. I felt a small warmth in my chest hearing those words, and I noticed Richard straighten slightly in his seat as well. "No one reaches the finish line alone," I said gently. Emily nodded and tapped her glass lightly with her fork as if she had just remembered something important. "Actually," she said, standing up slightly so everyone could hear her, "I want to make a quick toast." The table grew quiet as her friends leaned forward with curious smiles. Emily lifted her glass and looked around the room for a moment before speaking again. "Today, everyone congratulated us for graduating," she said. "But I think the real thank you should go to the people who stood behind us for all the years before this day." Her eyes rested on me and Richard again. "So this one is for the parents who drove us to early classes, listened to us complain about exams, and kept believing in us even when we were not sure about ourselves." The table erupted in cheerful applause, and several glasses lifted into the air at once. I raised mine as well, meeting Emily's bright smile across the table. Richard did the same, though I noticed a quiet reflection in his eyes as he lowered the glass again. The rest of the dinner passed easily after that. Stories continued, desserts arrived, and the restaurant slowly filled with the soft hum of celebration from every corner. Eventually the evening began to wind down as people stood to hug each other and exchange promises to stay in touch. Emily gathered her things near the door while her friends stepped outside to wait for their rides. I followed her toward the entrance where the warm night air greeted us again. The streetlights along the sidewalk cast gentle pools of light across the pavement, and the town felt calm now compared to the excitement earlier in the evening. Richard stepped outside a moment later, adjusting his jacket as he joined us near the car. For a few seconds the three of us stood there together without speaking, listening to the distant laughter of Emily's friends down the street. Emily turned toward us with the same hopeful expression she had carried all day. "Thank you for coming today," she said softly. "It meant everything to me." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "There was never any question about that," I replied. Richard nodded slowly beside me. "We are proud of you," he added. Emily smiled warmly at both of us before glancing toward the car. "I'm going to ride with my friends for a bit," she said. "We want to walk around downtown before everyone leaves tomorrow." I hugged her tightly before she stepped away, and Richard did the same. A moment later, she was crossing the street to join the group waiting near the corner, her laughter drifting back toward us as she disappeared into the glow of the streetlights. Richard and I remained standing beside the car in the quiet that followed. The envelope was still in his jacket pocket, and for the first time that evening he reached for it slowly before holding it in his hands again. "Everything changes after tonight," he said quietly. I looked down the street where Emily had walked away, her future stretching wide and open in front of her. "Everything already changed long before today," I replied calmly. He nodded once, understanding now in a way he had not earlier that morning. For a moment we both stood there in silence, the air cool and still around us. Then Richard slipped the envelope back into his jacket pocket and looked toward the road where the night traffic moved steadily through the town. The story we had shared for nearly 4 decades was ending, but another story had already begun unfolding in front of us, one that belonged to Emily and the life she had worked so hard to build. And as I stood there watching the quiet street under the soft glow of the lights, I realized something simple that felt stronger than anything written in the envelope Richard carried. Some endings are not about revenge or victory. Sometimes they are simply about finally standing still long enough to see the truth, and then walking forward without fear into whatever comes next.